We are live.
New leaf.
He sells stuff. We're live, folks. We are live. So we're going to call the meeting back to order. And this afternoon, we're going to hear from Julia Richter. And Julia's going to tell us some possible income tax structures we could try. Okay.
All right.
Welcome.
Thank you. For the record, I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. There is a presentation I put together, which is on the committee page under my name, and it's titled Potential Structural Options for an Education Income Tax. So I see folks have it out in front of them. So I'm looking at slide 2 here, and this is just kind of big picture what we're going to walk through. And this was really alluded to by both Emily and Graham earlier. But really first, we're going to talk about some potential big picture structures for an education income tax. And these structures, we put our heads together. We tried to think of, what are all of the different ways that an education income tax could look like in Vermont. And we found that all of these different structural options really seem to fit under 4 different umbrellas or fit into 4 different buckets. So what I'm going to be talking about today are those big picture buckets, where of course within each bucket there are a number of policy decisions, a number of nuances, a number of ways that those structures could be tweaked and adjusted. But it's really the overall structure that I'll be talking to today. So after walking through each of those 4 and really just kind of laying the groundwork, I'll go into some considerations of those different structures with respect to what my colleagues spoke about this morning with the principles of a high quality tax system. So to get started, just diving right in, the potential structures for an education income tax, these aren't put together in any particular order. They're really just designed, the order that they're in is kind of hopefully the most easy flow. But beyond that, there's no reflection. So option A, this is what the committee has heard some discussion about, and this is really falling under that structure that was presented in S212 and was recommended by the Tax Structure Commission. So this is where the homestead property tax is replaced with income education tax rates that are tied to a statewide yield, which is how the homestead property tax currently are. So I'm sure the committee remembers where it's tied to local spending decisions. And then the statewide yield sets those rates in accordance with what the district's spending decisions are. Under this option, we imagine that the non-homestead property tax would remain in its current structure. And all other aspects of the education fund would remain the same. So I'll pause there, see if there's any logistical or specific comprehension questions about option A before moving on.
Okay, so this would set would this be a surcharge on your income tax? Would it be a separate bill that would go out at a separate time? And the yield, I assume, the rate would be set based on what it was necessary to raise based on local budgets?
Yeah, great questions. I'll answer the second question first, because I think that one is a bit more straightforward. Yes, so this would be the way that the homestead property tax currently works, right? School districts vote their budgets, X number of dollars needs to be raised, and then the yield is calculated in such a way that the tax rates can be adjusted proportionately to fund all budgets that need to be funded and the remainder of the whole within the education fund. With respect to the first part of the question, where you were asking about how the administration would look like, that's really a policy decision that would be made further down the line if you were to decide to go with option A, right? How would it actually play out? I know it's not the most straightforward answer. And there will probably be a lot of not so straightforward answers because we're in this big, high level discussion. Any other?
I should know this because I was a co-sponsor of S212, but the S212 didn't lay that out about what, how it's collected.
So S212 did lay out a number of particularities in terms of how it would work. It had, I believe, there were progressive nature built into the distribution of taxes. So it would be become more complicated than the current system in that aspect because the rates would be adjusted progressively by the taxpayer. I will admit I'm not completely in the weeds with S212.
Yeah, you shouldn't.
And the reason that I referenced Chair Cummings' question in terms of it's a good policy question is because this is the basic structure of S212, but S212 did make a number of decisions.
And once we get through the sort of 4 options, each of them have like a whole bunch of administrative levers and policy levers that could be put within them to make them more progressive or more easy to administer, all those things. And we can sort of get into that after that.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, seeing no other questions, I'm going to move on to option B. This is another bucket of types of taxes, education income taxes. So this would be similar to H911 that Representative Beck mentioned this morning, where an education income tax would be added to the education fund as an additional revenue stream. So property taxes would be kept, the income credit would likely be removed. And we were thinking that the education income tax would likely, and of course this would be a policy decision, it could have brackets. So those brackets wouldn't be tied to local spending decisions, but those brackets could be as progressive or not as the committee desired.
Why would we remove the income credit?
So
because right now it says you can't spend more than. Would we say you are going to spend X amount or?
So the income credit is referring to that income sensitivity.
Yes.
And maybe this was too far of an assumption that we made and you could keep the income credit. The reason we included to remove the income credit came from some of this discussion of the committee's meeting last time where we were hearing that they wanted the system to be more simple. So this would be a way of potentially addressing simplicity. You could keep the income credit, but it would be that complexity.
Addressing that skin in the game too.
And my understanding is that if we threw a new revenue stream into the ed fund, then the yield would change to a point where property taxes would likely get quite low.
Right. So the more money that you're putting into the education fund from other sources, the less that remainder is that needs to be made up with property taxes.
Right, but we're talking about skin in the game. If I'm a poor town and the rich people are going to be paying for this, I now don't have as much skin in the game as I do. I mean, it's whose skin is in. I mean,
that's an excellent point. And it does address that question of cost containment. And I actually do have a slide towards the end that just talks about some of these considerations of what does cost containment look like with these different structures and skin in the game. As that's a conversation point that frequently comes up in the ed finance space.
I'm going to go.
Okay.
Represent Beck, Pearson, and Purcell.
Just to give a little for those. So in 9/11 did not remove the income credit from homestead property taxes, but there was a cost containment mechanism in there through the recalculation of the yield a different way. Yeah.
Okay, Senator Pearson.
Does this did 9/11 do anything to the non-homestead?
No,
That just was
didn't touch it. Yeah.
So if I may. This is getting a little bit weedier, of course, as this conversation is going to keep going. Another question would be, if you were to decide to go with the route of option B, how would those revenues fit into the education fund? Would those revenues be solely used to buy down homestead property taxes? Would they be used as just an additional income stream to buy down both homestead and non-homestead? Those are more of these
Right.
policy questions. We're kind of at the very top of this decision tree, right?
Right now, things have to move up or down proportionately.
Unless the legislature decides otherwise.
Which we do every year.
Well, of course. Senator Pertzl.
Representative Beck answered my question.
Okay.
His explanation.
Keep going.
All right.
You're quiet.
Okay, option C. So this is another option where the homestead property tax would be replaced with an education income tax that's not tied to a statewide yield. So it's not directly tied to spending decisions, as we see now. So this could be as progressive or not, as the committee was interested in. It would be forecasted like other revenues. And a few nuances with this idea would be it depending on the level of local control over spending decisions, that necessity for a flexible lever may or may not be as present. In this option, the non-homestead property tax could be retained as a flexible lever to address those shortfalls, or the stabilization reserve or an additional reserve could be added to the education fund to also serve as a flexible lever.
Senator Pearson.
So in other words, the legislature would just say, everyone's paying a 2.5% on their income tax. Is it everyone or just, well, homesteaders would pay that? But then I guess my question is, how do you deal with Brigham in terms of some kind of equity between districts?
Right. So Abby, unfortunately, is caught up. I'm pretty sure that she will be joining. I know that I've talked to Abby a little bit about these different options and how they would comply with Brigham, and I will defer to her once she joins to address that.
But my understanding of how the scenario would work is that people can still, unless levers change, people could still spend as much as they want. And there's Abby.
There's
Perfect
Abby.
timing. The burden would still be shared equitably across the state. It's just the part where your rate would go up more if you spent more locally is what would not.
Yeah, but that's part of how, the way I think of it, or, maybe check my understanding, is that we sort of have taxpayer equity and we have district equity, so that we don't have wild diversion between districts.
And this would keep that wide divergent between districts from happening, because it would be a statewide tax.
So if I may, within this option, as Representative Kornheiser is mentioning, because it's a statewide tax, it would be a statewide bracketed income tax. So across the state, folks in these different income brackets would be paying these different percentages. The question with respect to Brigham and equity comes down to, I believe, and I will defer to Abby, but up to how spending decisions are made by districts. And this isn't saying that it's going down to being districts are raising the money that they need for the school. This is retaining the statewide tax structure.
Right. It would be distributed. So the rich towns wouldn't get more money. They would get enough to do their budget. So you wouldn't have the towns with all the second homes and not putting kids in the schools, raising money on a 28 or 1% rate, and the smaller, poorer towns having to do a 20% rate to raise the same amount of money.
And most, most other states or states frequently use what's called a base funding formula. And that's where they say there's X number of dollars per pupil in the state. And that's how they determine how districts are funded. And then like the weights that Vermont employs, they employ weights and use those weights against the base level. So this in this scenario, you could get rid of the local spending decisions and figure out, what is the base level? How are the weights applied?
Which is what other states do. They say it costs $15,000 a student. They raise $15,000 per student and they give it to you. If with weights or whatever else. I think that works everywhere else, except a whole lot of other states are under issues with courts for the inequality. So I think if you're then allowed to raise additional money based on either your local income or your local property value, that's where the inequalities and imbalance come, and that's where you'd have trouble.
And that's kind of like what we used to have, right?
Yes.
Yeah, actually all states, with the exception of Vermont and Hawaii, Vermont, because our property taxes are considered statewide, use at least some proportion of local property taxes to fund their public education.
I mean, I don't think it'd be a Brigham violation to have the same rate for different levels of spending. But what would prevent any district from just saying, whatever.
That exists today though, right?
Abby.
Right, especially because we got rid of the excess.
Why don't
Getting further afield.
Why don't we have Abby up and so we can stop hypothesizing?
Yeah. There's actually another nice chair over there.
The wheels throw me off. So for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. Maybe it would help if we took a step back just to remember what Brigham did say. And then I do just want to answer that quick question about tax rate equity that was not addressed by the court. They specifically declined to look at that issue. So this is great because this is all super on point and what I was hoping to pipe in at some point to add to Julia's slides, because she has set out different options that do not appear to pose any constitutional issues in terms of what Brigham said. So the Supreme Court of Vermont in Brigham stated that the state, not towns, is responsible for providing, so it's two parts, providing a public education to its citizens, that's the education clause, and ensuring substantial equality of educational opportunity, and that's the common benefits clause. And to fulfill its constitutional obligation, the state must ensure those two clauses are fulfilled. Where the court highlighted what is silent in the Constitution is how that right must be financed. So that is exactly what your discussion is. How the legislature determines public education should be financed is up to the legislature's discretion. That is not a violation of the Vermont Constitution. There is no requirement of absolute equality of funding. The question of tax rate equity was not addressed. That was one of the plaintiffs. There were three different plaintiffs. One of their claims, the court did not get to that claim, so that has not been considered. There's no specific system of education funding, and in particular, the Vermont Constitution does not require education funding to be based on property taxes, and it does not require local control, which is highlighted. There's no necessary or logical connection between local control over the raising of educational funds and local decision-making with respect to educational policy. So those are two areas where it's at the discretion of the General Assembly to set up the system as you choose. So I think that addresses some of those questions. I don't know if there were other ones. I'm sorry that I came in a little late.
But basically with equal access.
Correct.
To funding. They said, unfortunately, that was the one thing they could quantify. And because we had tax rates that went from 20 some cents, I think it was 28 in one of my towns, to $3.49 to raise the same amount of money per student. And it was a huge discrepancy.
So there is, again, no requirement for absolute equality, but substantial is the test.
And I think any of the studies that have been done have said that the present system does what we set it out to do, which is a penny on the tax rate in any town raises the same amount of dollars per student. So what we didn't address is that a penny isn't as painful to the relative wealth of some towns as it is to others. That for poor towns, a penny on the tax rate can cut into your bread and butter, and for other towns, it's decimal dust, and that's been the new.
And there was a recent case, and I apologize, I didn't bring that memo that I prepared on the 2022 case that did bring a claim about towns losing taxing capacity. So I will.
Whitingham case?
Yes, that was I think March or April of this year. So I will make sure the committee gets that. It was really just there wasn't anything truly new in that case, but the court did say, sort of reiterated these principles, and then did say it's not the constitutional requirements don't get at ensuring town taxing capacity.
Yeah, okay. So as long as we maintain equal access.
Substantially equal.
Substantially
Close to
equal. Yeah, I think we know we're never going to get completely anything.
And these options do not get at who is being funded, it's how it's being funded. And Brigham specifically says that's up to the legislature to decide.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hattie.
I'll be on the sidelines.
All right. Great. Thank you, Abby. So were there any other big picture questions about how option C may work? We're moving on to the final kind of more catch-all option, which is option D, and that's adjusting the current education funding system's thresholds. So as I know, the committee is well aware, there's all of these different thresholds that are set up, including the house site caps. Recall that's the $400,000 and $225,000 of your house site value, dependent on if you're above or below that income cap, which is $90,000. There's also the circuit breaker, which applies to households under $47,000, and then there's those different brackets underneath $47,000 for the circuit breaker. So there have been a few bills introduced in previous years adjusting some of these thresholds.
Sorry, finish your.
Okay, so the big picture for this option D is adjusting one or multiple of these thresholds to address the priorities or goals of the committee.
So if hypothetically, the house site cap was adjusted up to $3 million and the income cap was adjusted up to $1 million and the circuit breaker moved to 75, just throwing out random numbers. Would that essentially function like an income-based education tax, except only property owners with homesteads would pay it?
So it's a question that we've talked about internally within JFO. I think that the nuance here is that it still would be a property tax where there would be a credit to that property tax based on your income.
From the previous year.
from the previous year. So that's the first nuance that I think is really important to keep in mind. The second nuance I think is also noteworthy is that under the current system and the current structure, there are households who are technically eligible for income sensitivity if you just look at one or the other. You know, they have incomes below 90,000 or they have a house site below 400,000. At the end of the day, there are households where it's cheaper for them to, where they're not eligible for income sensitivity because it would be more expensive for them to pay on income than for them to pay on property. So I haven't run that scenario, so I, of course, can't give details, but I imagine there would be at least a good chunk of households that they wouldn't qualify for income sensitivity because it would still be cheaper for them to pay on property.
Or you could have a very wealthy, are we going by, I don't know what bill it was Senator Polina's who said you paid on your property or your income, whichever was highest.
I believe, I could be mistaken, I believe that bill was, if you were below a certain income threshold, you paid on whichever was lowest. And then if you were above a certain income threshold, whatever was highest. And that kind of construct, I thought, fit into this umbrella, right? It's very different than the current system, but when you look at all of the moving pieces of how that would work, it would fall kind of within this option D.
And our goal I guess what I'm hearing, you know, as far as goals, it would make, in general, wealthier people pay more into education. And I have this feeling that if we got more money in education, we'd spend more. So I'm not sure it would actually save at the bottom, but maybe we could put some caps in. I guess I still have one outstanding concern, which is taxing capacity. And if we use up that capacity here, what we're doing to the capacity of the general fund. And I think that's where our next meeting is going to look. It's what is that alligator claw?
I think in this option, you're still using the yield setting. And so you only raise the amount of money and put the amount of money into the system that the towns have asked for. And so that's one difference than, say, option B, where you're putting more money explicitly into the fund before it's requested.
I think there's a number of considerations across all of these. Taxing capacity, availability of funds, all of those are certainly considerations and likely considerations regardless if it's which option it is. I think that, you know, the option D is in some ways the closest to our current education funding system, given that depending on how many adjustments may be made, it still would be a property tax with income sensitivity. Whereas some of the others are either introducing the income tax as just an additional revenue stream, like you see in option B, or replacing the homestead property tax with an education income tax, as you see in A and C. One, where it's tied to local spending decisions and a statewide yield, which is an A, and the other where it's not. And so it introduces all of these really interesting education funding questions, be it school budgets, determination of how much money needs to be raised by the education fund, how is that money going to be raised? And then once we move beyond this kind of beginning of the decision tree, some of the more nuanced questions, we can get into those.
Senator Pearson.
I would just say, I worked a lot on these bills that presented here as option D, and in some different details, I think of them as income sensitivity for all, which is kind of just easy for me to think about. But one of the things that I was never satisfied about was that today taxpayers are motivated to file their homestead declaration and their household income because they are applying to see if they can get a credit. And there's a point in the spectrum where that becomes a penalty under this. And we never had a good answer for how do you deal with that? How do you enforce that? Because the motivation shifts entirely.
It's a requirement.
Well, it's a requirement, and if you do it, you're penalized potentially if you're at the higher end. And so that, that wasn't a trivial compliance problem in my mind. It does have some simplicity because we can all sort of understand, at least in this building, kind of our current system. But anyway, just flag that as something that we never perfected.
And I think we heard this morning that with the 116 towns where the non-property is lower than the property tax or the homestead tax, that there really is no compliance system set up. So this would just add to the non-compliant. I mean, some of these people probably own second homes somewhere else. And who determines how many weeks somebody lives somewhere? I ran into that with the second home tax discussion last year. If it's going to do anything, it would require some beefing up in the compliance area.
So I think it might be helpful if we all understand these 4 different buckets to walk through some of the considerations that we've put together. And I do want to reiterate that these are high level considerations and aren't meant to serve as an exhaustive list because we're looking at completely restructuring a tax system. So with that caveat, I'm on slide 10 of general considerations. And I really do want to emphasize the point that it's a highly complex and nuanced policy discussion that you folks are having. And because of this complexity and nuance, goal setting and prioritization is crucial. And I know that that's something that Graham was talking about, but I do think it's an important point to keep in mind that there are trade-offs, and there's going to be trade-offs across all of these different options. Which leads into the second point about priorities. What are the top priorities of this structure? And lastly, the general consideration is that the education fund is different. It's different than the general fund. How would shortfalls and surpluses be addressed in these different options? Mostly, or under the current system, most education expenditures aren't up to the legislature's jurisdiction. It's determined at the school district level. The revenues are up to the legislature. And also under the current system, the flexible lever is generally both the homestead and non-homestead. These are technically set in statute, but annually not withstood by the legislature in the yield bill. So just kind of those big picture, we've got these flexible levers, there's these different principles, just keeping that kind of in the back of our minds as we're moving forward with the considerations. So the considerations follow the same structure that Emily and Graham walked through. I'm on slide 11 here, and looking at sustainability and reliability, specifically at the volatility aspect. So we've ranked these options by what we consider the likelihood that they would be to increase volatility. So we think that the most the option that's most likely to increase volatility would be option C. And this is where the homestead property tax would be replaced with the education income tax, not tied to local spending decisions. We thought this because the income tax base, as Graham showed, is more volatile than the property tax base. And also, under this system, there may only be one flexible lever, the non-homestead rate, unless a reserve were to be introduced. And then moving down, I don't want to take up all of these committees' time going through. So feel free to speed me along or interrupt me if you have any questions, but
You're not taking up the time we are.
So then second, we've got option A, and this is replacing the homestead property tax with an income education tax tied to local spending decisions. We also anticipate that this would increase volatility, once again, due to that tax base, but likely less volatile because you would have two of those flexible levers, right? You would still have the income yield as well as the non-homestead rate to address shortfalls and or surpluses. Then we've got option B, which is adding that education income tax as an additional revenue stream and keeping property taxes. Once again, we anticipate it would increase volatility because of the tax base, but we estimate it would be less volatile than the previous two options because you would still have the homestead and non-homestead property tax rates, or the yield and the tax rate as flexible levers. And it would just be an additional revenue stream into the fund. And lastly, option D, which is adjusting those thresholds. At this point, it's too broad of a bucket to really know what it might look like because there are just so many possibilities that it's unclear. So any questions about volatility within these different options?
And basically, the more we depend on pure income tax with no tying, but the more we depend on pure income tax, the more volatile it becomes.
That's what we anticipate, yes.
Okay.
All right. Not seeing any other questions. Moving on, I'm on slide 12, talking about balance within the principle of sustainability and reliability. Once again, we ranked them in terms of likelihood. So we anticipate that C and A would, by and large, increase the share of income taxes and decrease the share of property taxes. I mean, that's what we're really talking about here in this committee. We listed C first because it would not necessarily aim to raise more than the homestead property taxes would have raised, but it wouldn't be as directly tied to budget decisions as option A would be. If within either of these two options, about 40% of property tax revenues would be replaced with income tax revenues. And then option B, where it's adding that additional income stream, this would increase the share of income taxes and decrease the share of property taxes. The extent of which it would do that would ultimately depend on the amount raised for the income taxes. So what those rates would look like. And once again, D, at this point, we can't analyze what that would look like.
Sorry if I wasn't paying attention there, that this is the increase of the income of the education fund.
Right.
Just of the education fund, not the income share in the state revenues that are going to the education fund.
Right. So as it is currently, this would be within the education fund, but we are not, from our end, we're not analyzing adjusting general fund revenue streams. So also when looking at the overall state, the revenues that come into the state, it would still be increased, but these percentages are specifically the ed fund.
This is Graham's little 4 boxes.
Yes.
Where you had income And
Property taxes, income.
the property box and expand so that income would be a significantly larger box than it is now. I
Right.
think it was 45%.
I don't know the percentages off the top of my head, but that's exactly the slide that we're talking about.
And it's the total, not the ed fund, but the total state tax.
Money.
I thought it was just the,
This, on the slide that we're looking at here, slide 12, this 40% of property tax revenues is solely talking about the education fund. But
the whole.
because we wouldn't be adjusting general fund income tax revenues, this would just be beefing up how much income tax revenues the state relies upon.
For the education fund.
For the education fund,
And
yeah,
But it would shift the balance in the total state.
correct. Because the general fund is staying the same.
Right, yeah.
Under these, and then we're talking about the education fund. And depending on where we adjust that within the education fund,
Right.
in turn, it's going to affect the education fund and the state as a whole.
Now, right now, we're doing the consumer taxes, which is sales tax. That is going into the ed fund. This would put a larger portion of the income tax base, additional income tax, and shrink the portion of the property tax.
Exactly.
Or I think we did hear from the League of Cities and Towns that the likelihood that the towns would spend more on property tax is pretty good because they too are facing, even with the infrastructure money that's supposed to be coming in, there's matches required and they're having trouble with attracting personnel and pressures on salaries, so that capacity could get eaten up fairly quickly too.
Right, and that goes right back to the cost containment, which maybe I should have put first in the presentation, but another consideration within cost containment.
I think for me, it's important to, if we talk about the ramifications of towns and whether or not they would look to lean more heavily on the municipal property tax, it ought to be phrased as a choice, right? They would then vote to choose to do that because perhaps they would look at it and feel like they have capacity, but it's not going to be foisted on people. It would be a decision that they make. And that just sometimes gets lost in the discussion. So to me, that's helpful to remember.
The districts they could play at that tax capacity as well. Not limited by the municipality.
Or no one could,
Or
right?
no one
Like,
could.
or that
Yeah.
might,
I
you
mean, it
know,
could be any combination.
I think in general, the poorer towns will hold back because they're poorer and the richer towns will not.
so I actually, when we were looking at some of this last year, what sort of continues to surprise me is it seems less about the actual median wealth of a town and more about the culture or socioeconomics of that town, you know? There are a lot of districts that actually have fairly low incomes that vote their budgets up every single year. And so we have some of the most integrated communities in America. And so I think it changes a lot of what might be sort of normal budget behaviors in other communities because our communities are so integrated.
Okay. All right. So I'm now on slide 13, and moving out of that sustainability and reliability discussion and moving into the fairness discussion. So just the reminder of the difference between vertical and horizontal equity. And so that's a big picture question in terms of what is the priority. And really evaluation of fairness ultimately depends on policy goals and design. So this is very high level. And so here are just some considerations. They haven't been ranked because these are just thoughts. So when looking at option A, which is replacing the homestead property tax with that education income tax tied to the yield, tax rates would still vary by town. So consideration of equity, you know, two households with the same income in different towns would likely have different tax rates and bills. That's the way that the current system works. It's based on local per pupil spending. Another consideration is that tax rates may be adjusted for progressivity. You might recall that this was the option similar to S212, and there was that adjustment. I do need to know it would add significant complexities to the system by adding that additional adjustment of rates, further adjustment of rates. Option B, which is adding that income tax as an additional revenue stream through considerations of equity, property tax rates would still vary by town, likely less, maybe less so because of that the property taxes would likely be smaller. However, they would be, they might be a bit more volatile with respect to the yield because the yield would be raising fewer dollars. The education income tax rates wouldn't vary by town, and the brackets could be made as progressive as desired. Option C, that's replacing the homestead property tax with an education income tax not tied to a statewide yield. So in this system, tax rates would not vary by town spending decisions if there were still, or I should say by district spending decisions. If there were still spending decisions made by districts, that would be a decision later down the road of the committee. Progressivity with respect to the brackets, of course, could be adjusted as the committee saw fit. And lastly, option D, which is adjusting the current system and its thresholds. This might be more difficult to target progressivity with respect to income as something that the legislature, the General Assembly has been struggling with, moving back and forth over the years, adjusting those thresholds and what in turn that looks like. Any questions about this fairness slide? Okay, not seeing any. Moving on to simplicity. Once again, largely will depend on policy design. Here again, they're not ranked because there's different simplicities, different complexities depending on the situation, and it's up to the committee to prioritize those. But that first option of the S212 construct, so the property tax credit would likely be removed. It wouldn't need to be removed, but if it were, that would be an added simplicity. Added complexities, we anticipate that there would be significant logistical and administrative challenges for both taxpayers and administration. That's something that Mr. Feldman spoke to last committee meeting. Furthermore, if it were to be designed to be progressive, there would be more significant additional complexities with respect to that next step of adjusting the rates. So you're adjusting the rates by the district and then adjusting the rates of that district by the taxpayer's income within the district.
Okay, so every taxpayer in the district would have to have the rate adjusted according to their income.
If that was a policy decision, there was something along those lines in S212. That wouldn't be needed for this system to function. The reason
flat rate.
Exactly. The reason I included it here is because it was included in S212. So just raising that trade-off that Ms. Burns spoke about with respect to complexity and fairness, you know, how do those scales tilt? And that next option of adding it as an additional income stream, if the property tax credit were to be removed, that would be a simplicity. A complexity, maybe less complex than some of the other things we're talking about. It would be another forecasted revenue source in the education fund. So there would be the associated uncertainties, but this wouldn't be incongruent with other state funds. I mean, that's how the general fund works. That's how other revenue streams within the ed fund, like the sales and use, meals and rooms, taxes work currently. The next option, which would be including replacing the homestead property tax with an education income tax that's not tied to local spending decisions. Once again, if the property tax credit were to be removed, that would be an added simplicity. And another simplicity here would be that tax rates wouldn't vary by town. So that would be more simple. And the complexity, same as the previous one, that it would be another forecasted revenue source in the education fund. Lastly, adjusting the current system's thresholds, simplicity is adding to an existing system, one that some folks understand. Added complexities is it's likely to add additional complexity to the system if it's tweaked more than it currently is. Okay, not seeing any questions. Senator Cummings?
Any? No?
Okay.
Let's keep going.
I have two more of these table slides for you and then I'll leave you to it. But I'm on the accountability slide here on slide 15. And this is that point that Mr. Campbell raised as well, but as long as tax rates depend on local spending decisions, not all taxpayers will know their tax rates when voting on the budget because it's ultimately a function of everyone's voting decisions. So it's just an important point to note, right? That it's a function of everyone's voting decisions. So it's just something to keep in mind.
We would say that about the current system, right?
Yes, because under the current system, like for instance, last year when there was the surplus of 95 million and the General Assembly hadn't decided how to spend that surplus or how much the rates were going to be bought down. There was that, as well as we didn't know which budgets would or would not pass, and if those budgets were going to be in line with the Agency of Education's projections. So budgets came in higher than we were anticipating. I don't remember by what percentage. I think it was around 5%. And then there was also the discussion of how to use that surplus. So taxpayers didn't know what their tax rates were going to be. And that would remain with the spending decisions if it's left up to districts and tax rates are tied to those spending decisions. So that's just what this slide is really laying out, because that was something that came up in the previous committee's discussion last or a couple weeks ago. If homestead taxpayers would know their tax rates while voting on local budgets. So the first option, no, they would not, because it would be tied to those local budget decisions. The second, adding the education income tax as an additional revenue stream, assuming that education income tax isn't used as a flexible lever within the system and remains relatively constant, they would know. But they wouldn't know their property tax because or their homestead property tax, because that would still be tied to local spending decisions.
Okay. And this would just be additional money coming in to the ed fund. Mm-hmm. Which means we could decide to use it to bring down property tax rates or hold them level. Mm-hmm. Or we could use it to pay off bonding for school infrastructure updates or PCB cleanup. So there would be a whole budgeting process.
Right. So the way that we envision this option B is it would be another line in the education fund, where right now you've got sales and use, meals and rooms, purchase and use, all of that. Lottery, Medicaid transfer. And then there would also be a line that says, education income tax, X number of dollars. And then it would be up to your discretion how those dollars would or would not be used.
Okay. And have we calculated now? I mean, I think one of the goals is to buy down the property think, buy down property tax rates for lower income people, and we've already got the credits going on. So I don't know if we're looking at increasing the credits and lowering what people making less than $90,000 are paying. You know, are we looking at lowering that? Are we looking at lowering the rates of people making 120,000? Or, you know, those are other levers we're going to have to decide on, and then figure out what kind of an education tax rate are we looking at? I mean, just to raise the present amount of money, have you calculated what kind of an income tax rate would be necessary?
No, I have not. I think I would need a bit more direction with respect to what kind of structure, what kind of rate, progressive or flat, who's it going to be applied to? Is it going to be consistent across? There's a lot of questions.
Got to give you more information.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I wish I had an answer and could just ping it back to you, but you do raise an interesting point that, you know, B and D maybe aren't mutually exclusive. Maybe you add an education income tax to the education fund and you adjust some thresholds. It ultimately depends on what it is that you're trying to do.
And I know we've talked about that 47,000 super circuit breaker, which I tried to raise a couple years ago because some of the situations, especially for people with medical debt, and got pretty difficult. You go over by, you know, $50 and you lose $5,000 to $7,000 in tax credits, and it was pretty punitive. And I was told that's very difficult because it involves municipal rates, and then we pay the municipalities back out of the general fund.
Yes.
So that's money that's going to come out of the general fund if we raise that and that.
Or not. I mean, we don't have to design it that way.
No, we don't.
Right.
But that is something, 47,000 is pretty low.
Is that just for the circuit breaker that comes from the general fund like that back to the towns, or just the circuit?
The municipalities are made whole, so to speak, with a transfer from the general fund.
For the circuit breaker,
Yes.
47.
But not for the adjustment.
But not for the adjustments. And they are kept whole for current use.
And how is and maybe I can get this offline, how is the regular tax credit through the town? Because the town is collecting it and then you're getting it as a credit.
It's out of the ed fund pays that back.
To the town, and the town pays it to the
I don't know.
person.
With respect to cash flow, I would recommend maybe bringing in someone from the Agency of Ed to talk about how all of those tax flow complexities work.
But I believe how it works is it is collected and then I get a credit on my bill.
Correct.
The town, but that credit on my bill is made up out of the ed fund. So the schools get everything. It all comes out of the ed fund. It doesn't touch the town budgets.
Because the town, before they vote on the budget supposedly in March, and then when the town does their tax bill, they know whether you'd get a credit or not. So you never get the full bill. You get a bill with the credit on
With
it
a credit on it.
because you filled out your,
Homestead.
unless you did an extension to October 15th. And I don't know how that works out.
No, we've extended.
It's the next year anyway. So
Yeah.
even if I got an extension until October, it's not
Based on the
it's not the bill. It's the bill for the following year that extension applies to.
So when the town sends the credit, they're really doing it for the bill.
You gotta do your
year and a half ago.
household, your homestead.
Homestead.
An extension for the previous year's filing. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I think Abby has
Figure it out
something
later.
on the flow
Yeah.
that she could help us with.
I don't need to know it now.
You gotta sit down here so I can see you. You're,
You definitely leave the chair there.
I'm not used to
Just leave the
this
chair.
kind of large room. Only the house gets these large rooms.
Well, not all of them. The committee is.
I'm used to having my 7 little people and 3 witnesses, actually.
If you want to give the house all the big rooms, you go right ahead.
I've had everybody on the screen. We haven't had anybody in the room for 2 years.
Yeah, we didn't either on Ways and Means.
So, okay.
I can confirm everything you were just saying, Madam Chair, so that's correct. It's on your bill. There used to be, and I actually would need to research because I don't have the institutional knowledge from my time here, but there used to be a credit that was paid to the taxpayer through the town, and there were issues with confidentiality. Now it's all on the bill, and you are correct about the lag because it's the way that it's calculated, looks at the prior year's income and the prior year's property tax, but you're getting it on your current year's property tax bill.
Based on that current year's budget vote?
Correct. Well, that's what you
Last
said.
year's
year's
income, this year's
Right.
budget vote.
Yes. This March budget vote. And then you see your tax bill August or later, depending on the town.
Leaves you with the outliers of people who lose their jobs, and that was the big concern with COVID, is that so many people got laid off. Their tax bill was based on last year's income, which was pretty good, and this year's income was nil. And we thought we were going to get a $150 million deficit, but it did not play out that way. It was one of our bigger miscalculations, but we didn't know about all the federal money that would come in the payroll. And there was, in the first years, the state sent you a check. And then you didn't owe that, if you didn't meet the requirements to get that check, when your income came in for that year, you had to pay it back. And I know the first year we got a check for $200, and I said to my husband, don't spend it, don't cash it, because you're going to owe it back. And we did. But people get really upset when they have to give money back to the government, and it was not. And some people spent that money on other things and then weren't able to pay their property tax bills. It got to be, there were a lot of complications, just getting cash going back and forth.
So can I clarify something? So under the circuit breaker, we need to make towns whole. Under current law, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. We could shift things. Circuit breaker could justify to the education tax and not to the towns or whatever. But and then the adjustment, there's no burden on the towns for that because that all flows through the state. Okay, thank you.
Unless we make
Unless we change
administration
yes.
more difficult, and then I'm sure they would want an increase in,
Another percent.
yes, in the amount of money we pay them to administer our tax.
Or they could just not administer it at all anymore. That's also an
true.
option.
That, they didn't want to administer it. Then when we tried to take it away, they figured out how much money they'd lose, and they decided maybe they could administer
cash
it.
flow.
Yeah. So that one's been a football.
So, and why is it that the circuit breaker does go through the town and the other tax credit doesn't?
Because the circuit breaker limits the amount you pay on your state and your local taxes. So it reduces the local property tax.
Okay.
And they didn't choose to do that. We did, therefore we owe them.
Yeah, get it.
Okay.
Thanks, Abby.
Just leave it.
Just leave it there.
And whistle if you have something to say, because yeah, you're not in my line of vision. And even the cameras are picking you up.
I think that's why she's sitting there.
A question?
I said, I think that's why she's sitting there. I was just kidding.
Yeah, maybe that's also wise. Okay.
Okay.
Completely lost your place.
No, I think we're still on track. I think that we had wrapped up the accountability slide. This is really just going back to, will people ever know, or will people know their rates when they're voting on budgets?
And right in the way this is built out, you're saying no with sort of, I would equate that to the fact that people don't know that now, right? So under current
Yes.
law, we're assuming they don't, even though we pretend they do. And in these future scenarios, they still wouldn't.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for the clarification.
We send out that November letter that says this is what we think based on these assumptions, but
Right.
I would say
And
that there are greater shades of gray than that, because really, when you go to vote on your school budget, you have a pretty good idea what your tax rate's going to be. The school district has gone a long way to coming darn close.
So if that's true, then in these scenarios, that would be true too.
right. So if I may, I guess I would say that given the level of information that school districts have available to them, they can project what they anticipate the tax rate would be. There are a lot of bright minds working within each school district figuring that out. However, there are a number of unknowns that they just can't know when trying to calculate those district rates. One of the big ones being what are ultimately going to be the yields set by the General Assembly. The other is what are all of the other districts going to do? So there is that kind of back and forth nuance, and maybe this is a bit too simplified, and it ultimately depends on the year and what the education fund is looking like. And if there are $95 million sitting on the bottom line, or what other school districts
for
are going
schools to get
decide.
shut down with PCB contamination.
Right, there's a lot of big questions coming up. And so this is really just hammering that point home that when voters are voting on their budget, usually on town meeting day, the yields aren't going to be set in session law until May. Often, a lot can happen between those 2 months, and that's really what this slide is trying to get at.
Okay, and did during the pandemic, so. Okay.
All right.
Keep going.
This is the last wordy slide that I've got for you. I've been alluding to it during the presentation, and this is touching on that education cost containment. So it's not cost containment is not one of the principles of a high quality tax system that we've spoken about, but it often comes up in the discussion of Vermont's education financing. So we thought it would be helpful to just put this together for you to ponder over. The first option, where there's that income education tax tied to local spending decisions, cost containment would be similar to what it is now. Education spending decisions would impact tax rates. I know that there's been some discussion today as to how much do they impact spending decisions, but this would be similar to the current system. And taxpayers would not know their exact tax rates when voting on budget. Moving on to B, where it's added, where the education income tax is added as another income stream, revenue stream. There would likely be very limited cost control, as property tax rates would be less than they are in the current system. So folks may have kind of less skin in the game, so to speak. On the flip side, there's also the consideration that potentially the increase of the sensitivity of the property tax may incentivize some cost containment. To what extent? Unclear. It's worth noting. Option C, this is the replacing the property tax with an education income tax not tied to local spending decisions. There's limited to no tax incentives to put downward pressure on local spending. This is the frequently spoken about in economics, tragedy of the commons, kind of some lack of skin in the game. If you can vote up your school budget and maybe it's not going to influence your tax rates, how is that going to influence your spending decisions? And lastly, adjusting the current education funding thresholds may not have the desired level of cost control if certain income groups or folks are shielded from spending decisions or, because of an increase in circuit breakers or additional exemptions.
So right now, the complaint I hear about no skin in the game is, and whether or not it's true is also subject to debate, is that if I'm covered under income sensitivity, I'm limited by my income as to what I pay. Therefore, I can vote for anything. And some school boards I've heard have actually said, you can vote for this and it's not going to cost you if your income is here because you're covered. And so they can vote up. Now we've put in there is an adjustment if your local school per pupil spending, I believe, is over the state median or average. And so I do pay a higher tax for schools in Montpelier than I would in Barry. So there is an adjustment. If it's enough, who knows? But if this is, it's going to be paid on the income tax, and my income is down there. I'm a senior citizen who I don't vote for schools because I'm on a fixed income, and what do I care? Which I don't think they do. They do vote. But I can now vote yes on everything, and I want kids to have this and this and this, and I can vote yes and it won't touch me. So you've got those kind of counterbalances for cost control.
So I think that, and this is something that I have heard a lot. I think that there's two things I want to touch on with that. The first is, I think you're referencing the excess spending threshold, which has been suspended and is still suspended through 2029. It was further suspended.
2029.
Taxes
Because of the people waiting.
by your local
So we're
spending.
waiting for that to come in.
True, but you're still protected.
You're still protected, but if you spend it, if you're below the excess spending, but your school spends more than the school next door, there is an upward adjustment.
Yeah.
Right.
Then the CLA may blow it off, but.
And I guess the other point that I do want to touch on, and this is one that I think is a nuance of the system, in that because there is an income yield and because there's a property yield, in fact, both the homestead property rate and the income rate are going to be adjusted in proportion with the school district spending. So it's
In current law too.
currently. So there's the non-homestead uniform rate, there's the homestead yield, and then there's the income yield. And as long as you're above that 47,000, the household income is above that 47,000 of the circuit breaker, you're subject to the property tax rate, and your property tax credit is going to be calculated based on your district's income rate. And that district income rate is in fact tied to your district's spending decisions. So if your district decides to spend a lot, even if you're income sensitized, you're going to pay more.
Right.
So I just think that that's an important nuance.
The only people that are truly protected are the people under 47,000 that have a house site less than 400,000. I mean, they have complete protection.
Right, but above that, it's shades of protection. It's not like you don't have protection. You have a level of protection if you are in the 47 and up to 90.
True protection.
Well, that because you're paying on the income yield, so you're still paying, you're paying less than you'd be paying if
You're
you.
protected from the property yield.
But you're not protected from your town's decisions
That's right.
about
Yeah.
your
Correct.
tax
Okay,
rates.
yeah, okay.
You are to a certain extent. Well, I guess if it,
You're protected from the property yield.
yes.
But wouldn't you be protected from isn't your amount of change in what you're paying somewhat limited? right? Isn't that what you're saying?
No, if your district spends the moon, then you're gonna pay. the
You're
moon.
jumping up by
Yeah,
the same amount.
Yeah.
But limited by a percentage of your income.
Yes.
No.
No, it's
No, because-
your district spending decision.
Because the
That's-
income yield, unless we're told otherwise, we model the income yield, the property yield, and the non-homestead uniform rate, the average bill of those to change in proportion with each other from year to year. And then within a year, the district's income rate and homestead property rate are both going to be proportionately adjusted upward or downward to the minimum based on that district spending decision.
Can I try an example of this?
Yeah.
So if my neighbor and I have homes valued at the same amount, but my household has an income of 60,000 and my neighbor's household has an income of 400,000. And my district decides to raise more money this year than they did last year. My neighbor and I will both have our tax rates go up. I will just still be paying less than my neighbor is.
Well, if your district increases the budget by 5%,
Yes.
do both of you feel a 5%?
No, because it's influenced by everyone else's spending decisions all over the state.
Well,
But like
but-
ishy, yeah.
But I
It could be
mean-
4.1
Right.
or 5.7 or whatever. But
And I guess I would agree, and I would just add one more touch of nuance that you're going to be paying the same property, in theory, you're going to be paying the same property tax, but the $60,000 income household is going to be receiving a income sensitivity to that property tax that the 400,000 income neighbor is not receiving.
But if the property taxpayer's bill goes up by 5% because of the whole thing, does the income sensitive payer also go up by 5% in this scenario?
No, because they have different yields.
Yeah.
They're in the same town. This is why there's confusion.
Yes.
Different yields.
The yield is calculated to go up the
Increase in spending as a function of one number is percentages, a different percentage, and it's a function of a different number.
That's why I would argue you are a little bit more protected.
so.
Well, maybe, but just because the income yield is higher than the property yield right now, but yeah. You're not going to see as big of a percentage increase, I don't think.
Yeah, I think you see it,
Yeah.
you may own, one may go up 5% and the other one may go up 3%.
Right.
Because of the income sensitivity, but
But this is, sorry to interrupt, but that's central to what we're discussing
Yes.
because I just voted for a 5% increase and I'm shielded by.
What you voted for was a 5% increase in your pupil spending,
Yeah,
but that's not how tax rates are necessarily.
but it translates to 5% on the property
Doesn't.
tax.
no,
But I think it's fair to say it has a bigger impact on the property taxpayer than
That's
it
true.
does on the income yield payer.
that is fair.
let's,
But the income payer does see a rise.
I would respectfully challenge that with the context that, and this is becoming a little bit too hypothetical for my numbers brain, but the sense that the rates are going to be adjusted in proportion to both your district's per pupil spending decision, every other district's per pupil spending decisions, and everything else that's happened within the education fund, including performance of sales and use, meals and rooms,
Right.
lottery transfer, adding universal meals. I mean, there's a lot of things that are moving within the education fund. So while you may be voting on a X% increase in your budget, regardless of that, what percentage increase that is on your pure pupil spending, it's not going to directly reflect in the change of tax rates for the next year, for both property and your income sensitivity adjustment.
I think in the pure sense, when this was done, it was meant, and there's a lot of other things, but there's a basic amount in the ed fund in the end. And that if you spent more than whatever we benchmarked, that you would pay more and the income sensitized people would pay more. Maybe not as much as non-sensitized, but it was based on your school spending. So you couldn't vote for, a 20% increase in spending and say, well, yeah, but it's not going to cost me anything. It will cost you. It might not cost you as much as the person, but that's when everything else is said and done and it all comes out of the formerly known as shark pool, and gets redistributed. But the bottom line is you aren't completely protected. You will see a financial impact if you vote to spend above a certain level.
Yes.
Okay. And
But
I
two
never
people in
thought,
the same town, in the same valued house, who both vote yes, won't necessarily have the same impact.
Look at the Burlington High
Yeah.
School bond vote.
Yeah, you could live in the same value home in the same town, vote yes, and feel a different impact.
Different levels of income.
Yes.
according to your level of income, over above.
Yeah, and
I never thought I'd say this, but I'm missing Senator McDonald sitting next to me passing notes. I don't think I've ever done a property tax discussion without him passing me notes. Because he does understand this. May not be able to communicate it, but he understands it. That's always been my discussion, and I wasn't on the committee when they did Act 60. But it does soften the blow. But I mean, the base question is that we've never answered is it a cultural thing? Why do budgets always pass in Montpelier and almost never pass in Barry? There are wealthy and there are poor people in both towns. This one is probably a wealthier town. But is the differential, is that what's driving it? Or is it more culture and tradition? And is it more just understanding the needs of, what kind of education kids need? I mean, why do they need robotics in 5th grade? Understanding that need, understanding maybe there's a need for some after school or preschool coverage because parents are working. I don't think we've ever definitively, I don't know if there's any national studies because they don't work on our system. But I don't, we all hear and theorize. But I don't know that there's any scientific study that has tied that down. And we could do we've done all kinds of stuff. We have put more stuff on the ballot. What your yield is compared to the average yield, what your spending per pupil is compared, all thinking that would make people think about their tax rates and have a cost containment thing. I've never heard it worked. They just cluttered up the ballot. But we've tried all of that informing it. The last one we did is we broke out your town and your school tax rates on your tax bill. So you knew, because some towns, actually, the town rate is higher, but.
We don't know that it's not working though either.
No, we don't. We just don't know. But school spending has continued to go up, maybe at a lesser rate than it would have, but we don't know how well the levers work.
I think our school boards solve a lot of those problems, and I think a lot of our voters trust our school boards, I think is what happens.
Yeah. Your school board says, I need this.
I think that's what happens.
It's local control. These are your local people.
I have a question that's kind of separate
Okay.
than that. And it's just basically for anybody. Is the issue of the $400,000 on the income sensitivity for the home, has it ever come up that a 400,000 house in some towns is very different than a 400,000 house in a dead towns? I mean, other than just people complaining about it, like, has it ever, like, as far as legislation or anything, kind of trying to deal with it? Because I've heard that recently, one of the new towns that I acquired in the district, like.
Every town's there's over 400,000.
What town's that? Just kidding.
We've got Stowe,
Just kidding. It was a joke. It was a joke. It
So
was a
we've
joke.
got quite a new variety of towns.
I don't recall anybody ever trying to have a variable number by county, town, or any other metric. But I'm sure some people think it.
But we tried to deal with that with the calendar reappraisal and stuff, like we tried to limit. how
Oh, the
much-
CLA,
Yeah,
yeah.
but that doesn't affect the value, like the type of home that you would, yeah, or just like a $400,000 house in Marshfield is entirely different than a $400,000 house in Stowe. Like, you can get a condo
Right.
that was built in 1968 in Stowe for $400,000, but in Marshfield, you can
The
get it.
assumption though is if you can afford a $400,000 home, whether it's in Pownell or in Burlington, you have the same ability to pay because you have declared yourself a person able to own a $400,000 home.
Unless you just have owned it for 40 years. And-
Yes, and
That's-
And that is
was
why we had the
issue.
income adjustment.
Right. In,
But I guess.
But with that cap.
Yes, with the cap. And
The cap is the question. Is-
I got 1,000 emails from Burlington folks when they
On the same issue.
reappraised because of that issue.
and that's coming up now because Montpelier, we just got the notice, the appraiser will be around. And we are I think it's starting to come down, but at the peak of the recent home rush. And it's going to make changes. And so if you buy a house now, the bank makes sure you can pay for it. So it does reflect
Right,
your income.
new home sales are different than,
But if you've lived there as long as I have,
Right.
I haven't been able to afford my house for 30 of the 45 years I've lived in it. But has to do with the housing market. But income it used to be your total wealth because you use land and you raise crops or you cut trees, and that was the source of income. The other thing we could do, and it was suggested by the original tax commission, if we wanted to get more equity, and we've got all those consumer taxes, is tax services. Rich people are more likely to use architects and lawyers and accountants than poorer people. But that's where wealth is being generated now, but that we haven't been able to get to that discussion, but it was suggested by doing that, we could lower the rate, which would make us more competitive to our neighbor to the east.
I think for me, regardless of what we wind up with, if we do wind up in this sort of fourth category, because it's all we can find our way towards, such as the legislative process, and we do adjust the thresholds, I think building in an inflator into new thresholds would be a wise decision for the future of legislators. And something that, was missing from this process the last go around.
And it would final negotiation tax bill easier because I can remember just finding out we're gonna raise the income level because $200,000 house is, 10 years later is not what a $200,000 house was. If I remember, and it was when I was working, so it wasn't very long ago, when the first $300,000 house sold in Montpelier. I mean, it was a big deal. And now I know what the small house across the street from me just sold for. And a $300,000 house is pretty minimal in the city of Montpelier. So those values do change, and income does change. And that perhaps we could ratchet down in times of recession, but okay.
So, any final questions about cost containment? Not seeing any. I'm just gonna really wrap things up on my end to final considerations. I've got 2 bullet points here. Just to remind the committee that this is a high level of analysis and it can really only inform at a high level. And lastly, ultimately, alignment with principles will or will not be realized based on the prioritization of principles and these detailed policy decisions. So are there any other questions from me about what I've spoken about here today?
Sure, there will be soon.
Oh, there were.
Okay, I'll be right over there. Thank you.
They're really close. Okay, I just passed down a list we came up with from last week's discussion. Can we assume that our first principle will be do no harm?
We'll do no harm. I mean, even harm is a trade-off, right?
That is true. All right, do no harm to whom?
Yeah.
So this
All right,
parking,
we can do harm, okay.
the parking lot,
Net harm.
the parking lot draft for me is, what's in there right now is sort of an acknowledgement that no matter which scenario we pick and ask to be modeled, we're going to need to address all of these factors. And so none of us needs to feel brilliant when we remember one of these factors. They're all here, so we don't have to repeat them over and over again. We remember that they're here and that we'll remember to address them all sort of early on in a conversation about something. Because a lot of these are sort of real, both equity and administration levers that are going to need to be. And so as people think of more things that need to go in this category, please name them so we can add them to the list. And we don't have to do that right now. I'm not suggesting we do that right now, but just want to sort of say that these are here and JFO is tracking them and we'll keep them handy.
And I don't know if they go here or not, but I have 2 concerns. One is if we tap more income tax for ed, what will be the impact on the general fund, which depends on the income tax to pay for basically all other state services except transportation? And are there lost opportunities? This taxing the upper bracket has been suggested for almost everything. If we use it, how much of it, are we giving up our ability to fund something else? Or do we just assume that we should do everything based on income and stop when we hit a wall? I don't know, but I'm assuming that there is what's fair is in the eyes of the beholder. And that there is a limit as to what we can get out of the top. And are we approaching that limit or are we taking enough out so that we can't do other things we may want to do?
Yeah.
I mean, we've got to look at this not here, but in a bigger kind of picture.
Madam Chair, can you help me understand? Because I think I do understand the basics of what you're saying, but I've been behind a lot of proposals that suggest wealthy Vermonters could contribute more. And I don't think any of them would become law. So it's not like we keep going back. there keeps being suggestions that we use that source of revenue, but we never actually do that. So is your concern that we will do it in this time and then we won't be able to, should we one day decide to do it, or that then people will want to additionally do it on top of that, and that will be, I keep hearing you say this, and I'm not clear exactly what you're concerned about, since we haven't done that, basically.
Well, I guess I'm working on the assumption that there is a limit to how much money we can take out of any group, okay? And I have worked under numerous administrations, found any governor that has been willing to raise taxes, even to protect the safety net in times of severe economic downturn, since Richard Snelling. So we have a general fund, and we have some areas that are have been just consistently level funded, not adequately funded. Mental health is one that I'm particularly concerned about. So I want to make sure that if we go to income here, and we don't seem to have an estimate as to how many, we don't have a definition of who's rich, that's up there. If we do that, I want to make sure that we are not going to make it more difficult for the general fund to raise, it's like water rights, to draw down what they need, if we can find a governor or a legislature that will, in order to protect the safety nets or adequately fund them. And then I just think we need to be cognizant of the fact, and the reason I resisted having this discussion come up in committee is because we are totally focused, and this develops a life of its own. And I think we need to say, okay, but if we take 20 million out here or 6 million, that's money we aren't going to have to fund primary care and free college and the Green New Deal and weatherization and the pension plans. I mean, this money, we look at it, and yet nobody has actually done an assessment of how much tax capacity is there. What I heard, public assets say is, no, they haven't done that. But if we're going to have the state, we want to have, we should do it on income tax. And I'm not going to fight that. But the countries that do it on income tax are paying a 50% income tax rate. And that's.
They have healthcare and college.
You do, they do. But that's killed.
Well, let's not.
But that has killed single payer twice in this state.
I guess where I'm confused about that, Anne, is that I think in the case of the education fund, there are very few people who think more money needs to be in the education fund as a pool. And so what we're talking about is having the same amount of money go in, maybe even less money go in, but definitely the same amount of money go in, and that it's just being calculated how many people pay how much in a slightly different way, but it's the same amount of money going in overall. So it's not that we're taxing the overall capacity of the state anymore. And I mean that, yeah.
Well,
We're swapping taxes, basically.
we are.
Which in theory, in practice, I understand.
But we are taking a good portion of the property tax off the table.
But it's still the same amount of, people still have the same amount of money in their wallets. And so
No,
if
some
they're paying
people don't.
No, I mean, overall, whether I'm paying a property tax or an income tax, it's still coming out of the same bank account of mine at the end of the day. And so whatever you
Right.
call it, I still have the same ability to pay regardless.
Except the goal of this is that people in the upper income brackets will be paying more.
And I haven't actually heard anyone say that other than you.
Well, those were the numbers that were brought to my committee.
Yeah, I mean-
Was it S12? I remember.
That's one of my goals.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm just saying no one has actually said that aloud yet.
Maybe where mine is, but my goal, I've heard the goal is, yes, it's not fair that some people are paying up to 10% and other people are only paying 5%, even though in hard dollars it's more. So that's part of what we need. It's, if they pay more for this, do they have the capacity to pay more for something else? Or are we limiting that ability? I just think we need to do it with our eyes open. I work in the assumption that money is finite.
I mean, I get the point, is that this is a way for the education fund to tap into the income tax stream. Nobody's talking about a mechanism here for the general fund to be able to tap into the property base of the state. So it limits the options of the general fund.
But that's not our assignment, right? The state could do that. The state, they're.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, I guess the concern about some prospective future legislation that, and pressure on the budget is a reason not to ever do anything. And that's a hard one to discuss because there's a bazillion needs out there. And so I don't know. I mean, I also think that the assignment in front of us is not whether or not we should do this, but how one would do it if there was the desire there. And I think that's a pretty different frame and important because there's a whole process and a whole new 180 people and a governor that have to decide whether or not to do it. So I would just offer that as something to try to keep in mind.
So is it, in the next 45 minutes, we want to get closer to clear questions that we're asking joint fiscal that are going to be sort of the answers to which are going to be what we're stuck with because they can't run
Right.
They can't build a new model for every meeting. So it's, they could shift levers within a model, but we sort of want to have some sense of what we're asking of them before we walk away at 4.
I've become curious about this idea of not trying to replicate the concept of you are paying for schools based on how you live in a residence, and now we're going to say you live in a house site, and instead of that you're going to pay on income. I'm just been curious about at least understanding what would happen if we just did a much broader, a line on the income tax that every income filer paid in a small amount. And then maybe you could back down for renters, or if you were a homeowner, but trying to understand that world is a way of, there's a lot of complexities that come up when we try to say, all right, you have been paying based on your home site, and now we're going to shift you to an income, and you're a renter, so we're treating you differently. And just wonder about if that's even worth trying to understand. Does that make sense?
No.
Just anyone that's paying an income tax in Vermont would have a line on there that would be a school amount.
Their school tax.
Yeah.
And
because my sense is it's a much bigger universe than the people we've been trying to figure out how to do, and maybe that's got disadvantages, surely, but it might have some advantages.
So are you thinking about that more like A or more like B?
Well, I don't think it's exactly like either of these, but I think it's.
Talking more like B.
I think so, yeah.
You could piece out the renter problem there if hypothetically, if the EIT if it bought down the homestead and the non-homestead.
Yeah, or I've always assumed you'd have to acknowledge renters are already paying in somewhere, some other way.
They are.
So you have to have some back out for them. But
So you'd want to do option B, so the income portion is not being shifted by local spending.
well, so you're asking me different questions totally.
Okay.
I'm not
Okay.
trying to fit it into one of the options that staff has pulled together. I'm saying what I keep hearing is a lot of the complications come up when we try to say you've been paying, income sensitized or not income sensitized for your homestead tax. And now we want to make that income direct tied to your income. As opposed to, well, maybe we should just look at the income tax, the people that are filing Vermont income tax, not all of whom live here. So that's why I keep asking that question, like, what does that look like? Does that give us 90,000 more people? If we're not, then Andy and his wife don't have to figure out if they're, if they're jointly filing and all that. I'm just wondering if that's even worth looking at. I don't know what the ramifications are, but I'm curious if anyone else thinks.
We would pick up those folks that are paying based on their property values at the low end.
Yeah.
Whose properties are worth, whose incomes are.
Yeah, I think you would have to have some ways of backing some of them out of it. But if that was a starting point.
But would you want that to change based on local spending or not?
Well, that's a separate question, but I also don't understand some of that. Like if you have, we've talked also about an income portion of it by income and a portion of it by property tax. Do you need both of those to adjust based on local spending, or could you just leave all of that?
Just the property and local spending.
Just adjust the property or just adjust the income? I don't understand how, but that would be good to understand some of the ramifications.
So, I mean, structurally, I'm not sure this is what I would want to do, but in D, D solves the problem that Senator Cummings has thrown out there, which is, we don't want to take capacity away from the general fund by. The problem with D is that if let's say you increase that 90,000 to, 150, and you get that 70% up to, 85 or 90%. The problem there is that money that those people are going to be saving, you have to get it somewhere. And I don't think there's any political will to get it from the people that are less than 90,000.
Right.
Which means you have to get it from the people that still don't qualify for that credit. Which basically, you can do that mathematically. It's very easy. You just drop the property yield. And that would increase the rate, and that would capture the money from those people on the higher end. Now, I'm sure they don't want to pay an extra 10 or 20 cents or whatever that would be. But mathematically, that you could do that, and it would solve that problem that you're talking about.
It would still.
You wouldn't be impacting the general fund's income tax capacity.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you would by dropping the yield.
The property yield.
The property yield, it would get people at the upper end.
Above 150 or whatever that number is.
Yeah, who owned $1 million house. They would be paying.
Pay a little bit more.
They'd pay a little bit more.
400.
But it would go under property. Okay.
The other thing about
property tax.
option D is you don't have to solve a renter problem.
You don't.
You could keep.
You don't, so the question is though, this decline in the you know, that's still really where it highlights the regressive nature of our school funding, right? Do you see that as, we tried to do it in.
Can I see your thing?
Yeah, we tried to do it in S 52 by requiring everybody to come in and pay based on income, but it was logistically difficult.
So basically what it would look like is you take this peak right here,
Yeah.
you chop it off, and that peak, what you chopped off would push over into these people. That's what it would graphically
So it would
look like.
flatten it out.
Yeah.
It would be better than it is now.
And was it the 80% of the payers are falling in before that peak?
Yeah, or at the peak, yeah.
Right, they'd be unaffected. They would be the people beyond the new, whatever that number is that would be.
And would you move the house side up too? I mean, now that our property values are so, you know, so screwy.
It'd be a different policy lever, but
You're not paying on what the realtor tells you can sell your house for. You're paying on the assessed value.
No, I know, but.
And then we've got a 3-year rolling average to bring it in, so.
but when you increase that number, or you increase 47K,
There's all room.
well,
Yeah.
you're gonna raise less revenue. So where are you gonna get it from? Are you gonna get it through the income yield, or the non-homestead, or the property yield? I mean, those are just policy decisions.
Right, that breaks into, if you go after the non-homestead, then you start wanting to perhaps break that down into different categories.
Very much so,
Yeah.
which is,
Yeah.
it certainly seems time for that.
Yeah.
But if you go to a bigger number than 90, you're gonna push more, you're gonna have more people paying based on income.
Right.
And that doesn't get you to 100%, but, moves the needle in the direction I think that you want to go.
Well,
This is democracy. No one gets 100%.
I mean, a lot of the discussion, let's face it, really is a middle-class tax relief, right? I mean, we've already taken care of,
Yeah.
Yes.
by and large, that, but it's the sort of people that are like, damn it, I got a $10,000 raise.
Well, it also, what do we mean by middle class? Is that,
Well, right, I mean,
I think some people making $40,000 a year think of themselves as middle class.
Yeah, well, right, that is fair, but I'm talking about sort of the $100,000 to $150,000 household, which is kind of two professionals.
Yeah.
And they're.
2 kids in daycare, you're struggling.
and
Two
they're-
teachers.
Student loans.
And they're maxed out of all of.
We're forgiving student loans,
Yeah,
maybe.
Maybe.
well, that's intriguing. I mean, I'd definitely be intrigued to see, I don't know that we can model it, but to see some understanding of what you're describing.
I think that Julie can speak to this better than I can, but I think the difficulty is when you get up into those higher income regions, we don't necessarily know what the household incomes are. Is that true, Julia?
Yeah, because they don't have to file
They
it.
don't file. I mean, I think Jake has done some
He did more.
trying to project and different things, but we don't exactly know what those numbers are.
They don't need to file it on their property tax,
Right.
but aren't they filing an income tax one?
Let's let Julia answer the question.
Julie Richter, Director of Fiscal Office. I know that there's some data sets that have tried to put together, Deb Brightman has done a lot of this, and trying to put together household value or house site value and household income. At the end of the day, I don't think that there's a perfect data set that exists that I'm aware of. It would be a conversation that I would need to discuss further with the tax department and Deb. If that were to be a route, but there certainly, from my understanding, would be modeling challenges.
So the data's there, but they're in two different data sets. There's no way to line them up is what we're saying.
Is my understanding.
That's right. There's some approximation.
And I thought Jake had done a lot more to line it up as part of the report that they're doing. But maybe I'm wrong. about
Yeah, so I would really get touch base with
that. Okay,
Jake.
cool. Okay.
I guess, and this I think is what you said earlier, Representative Kornheiser, about if you just took off the cap of if it's based on income, does it matter how much the home is worth? Like, do we need to have that number?
At some point I do think that there's probably folks in Burlington and a few other places that might have homes that are now worth 450, that certainly would benefit from an income adjustment and are now being excluded from an income adjustment.
Right, but is there a reason, what is the only reason that we have the cap? So let's say you.
Oh, get rid of the cap, sorry.
Like if you inherited a farm and it's worth $4 million, but you're only making $45,000 a year because you're selling some honey on the side or something. Does that matter?
Well, you have current use then, so let's not, I feel like farms are always
Okay.
like red herrings and conversations.
Yeah, okay, it's just,
Let's talk about houses.
yeah,
Inherit a house in Stowe.
yeah, you inherit a
$1.5 million house in Stowe.
or a piece of property, yeah, the house, yeah.
Right.
You got a couple of.
But for whatever reason, your income is low. Is it, the only reason that we do that is just because it seems unseemly that somebody with such an expensive home would get their rate reduced.
Except if you are on a fixed income, you have paid your mortgage when you bought your house. A $450,000 house 20 years ago in Burlington was a mansion. And now it's probably,
Bungalow.
yeah,
Well, here's,
Truly, I mean,
or a garage. I mean, I know, I'm looking at houses in my neighborhood that were starter homes that are going for $450,000. I don't even want to know what my house, which is a slightly larger ranch house, is going to be assessed at. But my income is not changing.
right, that's why I wonder if there's other ways of, and one way that we could address the purchased house, and we have the 3-year thing, but right now, if you buy a home and you bought it for less than the assessed value, you can go to the town and say, it's overassessed, lower it down. But if you buy a home for higher than it was assessed, the town can't say, hey, obviously the market value is higher than we had it assessed for. We're going to reassess it at a higher level. You're not allowed to do this, the town. I think it's unfair to the town. I don't know if this has come up, but it's one way to deal with the difference between somebody that lived in a home and then it slowly got more value than to when you just buy an expensive home.
I think there's also a policy question around, let's say you inherited that $2.5 million home and you don't have very much income. Do we want you to keep it? Does the state of Vermont want you to keep that $2.5 million home? Or do we want it maybe to be sold and subdivided into 5 very nice apartments?
We did forgive your state tax, so apparently we've recently decided that.
Yes. And we already have given you a massive tax benefit in another way.
I mean.
And so when we make decisions to protect certain folks from tax liability, are we making those as careful policy decisions about what they do for the housing market? Or are they, because we have this sense that if you can't afford your home, we should make sure that we protect you in every case possible? I'm not sure. I'm sure either way. Like I see Graham has made the point, as has Jake, about the fact that, we're keeping older Vermonters in their homes that might not be appropriate homes for them, and there are policy decisions there. I don't know if I want to be the one making the policy decision that older Vermonters shouldn't stay in their homes that are paid off, even if they're too large, because there's nowhere else for them to go.
That's the
Anyway,
problem.
isn't it really for what we're trying to do here? I mean, I realize that qualifications exist.
Yeah.
And there's other things the government can do to solve that than just kicking old people out of their homes. That seems like a bad.
I'm getting very uncomfortable with this discussion. Because I'm in that age bracket where you want to kick me out of
Sorry,
here.
Ann.
It's my home.
you're moving.
There's a lot of.
Where? There is a group of people in Montpelier that have been trying to find a place to downsize for at least a decade. And you cannot build,
By Jacob's property.
you cannot. There is no place to move unless you want to go to one of those luxury prisons where everybody is old and gray, and the depression of living there would kill me.
And I'm not saying I want to kick anyone out of their home. I'm good. Yes, but I'm saying, but there is sort of,
Campaign slogan.
yeah.
Move them out.
But I do think there are these interesting policy trade-offs where we're prioritizing the tax burden on households that have already paid off their mortgage over some folks who are still paying their mortgage, just for instance.
there are a lot of reasons for people to move out of houses that are too big for them or
Yeah.
too valuable for them, other than just the education property.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah.
It's just that the rapid increase in property value versus how much one can afford
Yeah.
for school tax is pretty disconnected. And it becomes especially obvious when we're talking about somebody that's lived in their house for 15, 20, 25 years.
545.
I know the last time we adjusted the 400 and 225 was in 2018. I think we were both on that conference.
It's
And
not a very long time ago.
JFO, at that time, I mean, there were all kinds of different numbers that were floating around and they were able to calculate very quickly what the impact to the education fund was. I'm not sure what the capacity is now, but there is an impact. And it's actually, it's bigger than, when you go from
Yeah.
500 to 400, it's a bigger impact to the education fund than you might think.
But you were pairing your concept with reducing the yield, which effectively ups
That would increase the.
bill,
Yeah, increase the yield.
increases the
Yeah,
yield.
yeah.
Which ups the bill on non-sensitized, well, on everybody, but then.
No, it lowers everybody's bill.
Well, right, that's why you were saying to decrease the yield, which would up at the far end, right?
Well, I mean,
That's what I want to understand.
but basically people were trying to build up the yield and to bring down the average property tax rate. It was probably a year when the yield was pretty tight. And people looked at that and they said, well, where could we go to do that? And somebody said, well, how about the people that have an asset that's worth more than $400,000?
Yeah.
That's where it came from.
But I misspoke. So what your variation on D was to
That's just adjust what we have.
adjust the yield in a way that increases the bill for the people who are out. So as we swell the universe that's income sensitized and you raise the homestead rate, right?
Yep.
I just want to restate it.
right.
Then effectively you're raising rates for the top end.
Above whatever that number is. Yeah. That was my only variation was that, if you do that, where do you get that money? And one way you can get that money is you do it through the property yield and then you get it from the higher income earners.
And that takes
Or at least
care
the
of
higher
the
property.
challenge we had, which was how do you force people to do their household income?
You would have more people that would be,
Incentivized.
it would be worth their time to do it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or you don't worry about the connection between their income and the.
Graham has appeared. I have a feeling.
Oh,
great.
how exciting. Insights to offer.
This is like the.
Because I'm thinking of a thing of between having the education income tax, but not have it tied to the yield. We do this on the income tax forms and we don't try to do everything on the property tax form. We lower the basically property tax. And then on their income tax forms is where you're making the adjustments.
Based on the district spending?
Yeah, you still have.
True up?
Yeah, you're kind of truing it up on the income tax forms instead of trying to do it all through the property tax rebates. But I think what it doesn't solve is that problem with somebody that lives in a $2 million home but has a low income. Like they would be allowed to do that. We wouldn't be moving them out so we could create more housing.
The only way you could protect them is to bring the $400,000 up or eliminate it.
Or you just eliminate it because it would be hard because we can't really figure out for someone's income and house value.
Remember, you're only protected on the house site.
Right.
On everything after 2 acres, you're paying full boat.
Yep,
Property rate.
I am.
You had that land.
I got 9 unusable acres. You have to have a horse if we want to log it. Graham, you've been listening, I assume. Right now, I think the proposal I'm hearing is that we keep income sensitivity, maybe even ratchet it up a little bit. We go with D, but we lower the yield And that would force,
You would reduce the property
Property.
yield and increase the property
Income.
rate.
and increase
Yeah.
the tax rate, which would then increase the taxes on higher income people. Because the people with sensitivity would still be protected, I assume with the same adjustments for your local spending.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah,
In
so
income, there would still be an income yield.
Yeah, okay, there would still be an income yield. But any thoughts on that one?
I'm sorry to jump in. I just wanted to just maybe add a little bit of color and perhaps help the committee a bit. And this is Graham Kim of the Joint Fiscal Office. So what I'm hearing from the committee right now is a sort of desire for fairness or progressivity more in the code with a mix of cost containment. And I just would add, JFO, I think, can do modeling on some of these proposals, and I think we can, show some numbers once a firmer proposal is sort of put forth. But what I would say on option D, Julia and I and Emily talked through option D proposals, various things. And one of the things that we found, sort of talking it through, was that you would increase the rates or the amount paid on higher income households. But the thing with D is that it's kind of a sledgehammer with respect to doing that. So as Representative Beck said, you'd be slicing off the top of that hump and distributing it amongst the higher groups. But you would not be doing it I think, in a particularly targeted way. So you'd be putting, additional money on the backs of higher income taxpayers, but not necessarily in a way that would match, perfect goals for, progressivity, because you just have a constant disconnect between house values and income at those higher ends. So I would first say that. So I guess if you're considering option D, you would get higher taxes paid amongst the higher end, but you would be doing it in kind of a sort of rough and ready way. And the second thing I would say is that, when we talked about option D, one of the things that Julia had prepared for the Senate Finance Committee last year in response to Senator McDonald's proposals were some various options for expanding income sensitivity. And the overall cost of some of those, which were, I think, on this, small end, pretty small, but on the bigger end, things like setting the house site cap to 400,000 for everyone. The sort of scale of the change that you're talking about under sort of an option D is very much what I would call a tweak. So you're talking changes in, somewhere between the $10 to $50 million range, depending on how drastic you wanted to go. But compare that to sort of options A, and C and B. You're talking in those proposals, you're really moving towards a full change to the system in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Even in option C, H911, the income tax surcharge that was going to be dumped in the education fund in 2018, that raised, I think, over $60 million. And so I think in general, the changes that could be achieved in option D are, I think, in terms of the scale relative to the other three, are much smaller, and I think quite a bit less precise on the fairness measure. So I think you do achieve some of the goals by putting more money onto higher income households, but you would definitely be sacrificing sort of the specificity of the households you'd be wanting to target. But on the same hand, you're operating within a current system. It's something that we do already. So there has those advantages as well. But I wanted to sort of pipe up for the committee to let you know that, as we talked through option D, these were the type of things that we were talking about as staff about, fairness is the goal. You're not going to be as targeted, and you're not talking about sort of the scale of the other options, unless you were to do something truly drastic as an option D proposal.
Graham, if we did something like this, though, one of my concerns has been told for years that 50% of the people in the top tax bracket this year will not be there next year, that generally they've sold something. I remember the guy that sold off acreage so he could pay his property taxes on his farm, and then found out because he got the money for the acreage, he didn't qualify for income sensitivity, and he lost his acreage and wasn't able to pay his taxes any better because his taxes went up. There are people, and I've heard from them, that sell the family deer camp and so they get an influx, but that money is going directly out to pay for their nursing home or their medical care bills, and we don't let you take much of that off. I have a harder time saying, well, they can afford it this year, so we'll tax them, than I do somebody who's just basically bringing in, $500,000, $600,000, $1 million a year. So if we stick with the house value, that kind of takes out that, what about those 50% people who aren't there next year? Which to me is one plus. But
Yeah, I think the analysis that you're referring to comes from the 2017 tax study, which looked at filers with adjusted gross income over 300,000, about the persistence of that level of income, whether they stayed at that level for long periods of time. And I believe that analysis was, as you suggest, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I believe it basically was saying that people in that group of income tend to have their income is not the same. It's not in $300,000 every single year. It's more one time in nature. We did some research on this, I think in 2019, that sort of added to this, that found that while high income taxpayers, it is somewhat of a one-time event. What you see is not that they become not that they don't become high income anymore. They're still high income. It's just not at the level that they were before. I think this was from our migration study, but for taxpayers who moved to the state that had very high incomes, this is not the exact same as the analysis in the tax study, but when they moved, they had very high incomes. But then 3-4 years after the move, they still had relatively high incomes, but 20 to 30% less than what they had before. So it's not. It is. I think high income is not every single year for every taxpayer, but I would push slightly back in terms of the analysis that said that people who make $300,000 become a middle income taxpayer thereafter. But that is again the nature of high income. A lot of it comes from capital gains, and that's what happens with capital gains. You tend to realize in chunks.
Graham, when you were referring to the blunt instrument in option D, is that because folks who, if we sort of increase the number of folks who are getting the income adjustment, everyone is sort of getting adjusted the same rather than the kind of brackets that you might see with an income tax? Or are you just talking about it being a blunt instrument at the top?
I would say a mixture of both, but I was in my initial comments, I would say the latter part. So if your goal is to make higher income people pay more, it's a blunt instrument, because there's again that mismatch between income and house site. And so while you would make all those bars on Senator Pearson's chart go up slightly, in the higher incomes, it's not. I cannot guarantee that it's as if they would, for the really high income people, they'd come up higher than the sort of middle high group, if you will. And so in the same way that you could definitely guarantee that with an income tax structure, by creating a bracket.
It'd be less regressive, but probably still regressive. Well, if I could ask, Representative Beck suggested, Graham, that JFO may have a tool that's set up to give us some understanding of that. I mean, is that as simple as opening up an old spreadsheet and tweaking numbers, or is that a big lift? I mean, I guess I am curious to see it if it were easy, because logistically, it's one of the easier options in front of us. It would be a variation of D. I don't think.
My comments about whether the model was built or not was only based on the 400 and 225, those numbers. Because I know we went through that exercise in 2018.
Well, I think it would be helpful to see those numbers.
Yeah.
And I agree that the concern that is maybe too modest. It's not a whole scale system change, but if it were a significant step in the direction, it'd be worth understanding, I think.
And I guess I don't have a sense of how significant or insignificant it would be, so that would be helpful for me to understand.
So if we could find some numbers around that, I think that would be helpful.
If nothing else, we must have the JFO analysis that they presented to that committee that said what happened when you went from 500 to 400. And we went, what did 225, what was it previously?
It was 200 or 270, that's right.
275.
The House wanted to reduce it and Senate wanted, that was the usual scenario. Senate wanted to increase it.
We at least have those fiscal analysts on paper.
Yeah.
Paper somewhere, sure.
Probably.
Yeah, we could look at what we did for H911, but I would hesitate to sort of say that we can provide numbers at this point, because I don't know exactly we don't know what the proposal is here. I mean, I think at this point, we have to go back to the tax department and ask if this is a type of thing that we can do across the entire taxpayer distribution. Do we have the data set to do this type of analysis? Because I don't know whether we do or don't. I know we did something for H911, but I don't know whether that was a much more narrow scope of data pull than what is being proposed here. What I can tell you is that I remember in H911, this is sort of me being in the room when these discussions are going on with Mark and Chloe, is that those analyses for the property tax portions of 911, I remember those being shall we say, strained trying to get those numbers right, as opposed to the income tax ones, which were what I was modeling. I remember those two going back and forth on the modeling because they were having trouble matching up AGIs with households back then. So I think the short of it is that we can, at JFO, can go back to the tax department and talk about the capabilities, but I don't think we can give you any analysis unless we have a proposal to really.
Well, so the proposal or concept was to drive up those property value thresholds, and we could pick a number, and then drive up the income levels that would qualify for an adjustment. Mm-hmm. And so if the difference to what you're saying is for us to just pick some numbers right now to get a really crude understanding of that, I bet we could do that. If you're saying even then you'd have to figure out if it's possible, I think that's kind of a different discussion. So.
And I would love, when we're having the conversation, when we are picking thresholds for anything, instead of saying numbers like 400,000, we talk about quintiles or something like that, so that the circuit breaker would be at the bottom fifth quintile, and the folks who are subject to an income yield would be at the first 3 quintiles, or like whatever we want to do, but that we think about it in terms of that rather than in whatever our own perceptions of property values are in our own community and whatever we think normal income.
That would move,
and then it would
things automatically
yes.
as we go forward. If we say within this quintile, this is an inflator, but right now, a sledgehammer might be harder to get through. But there is also the possibility of phasing it in over time. I wouldn't stick with present housing values, because the only thing that goes up and down with about as much regularity as the stock market is the real estate market. And it's, unless history is completely violated, it's going to come down. And if we have a recession, it's probably going to come down hard and fast. So to do it in quintiles so that would allow us to figure everybody into what
And it's a good
property
principle.
values are in the state. Yeah. I don't know. So I guess what we're asking is, can somebody model if we raised income sensitivity up to what, 100,
Based on a quintile, I think.
based on a quintile? But I don't know what the quintiles are.
Well, it's already about 80% of
Not-
filers.
90 is, well, yeah, that's okay, yeah. It's gotta be higher than 90 because 70% pay.
Well, that's.
Graham, can you recommend quintiles that would be appropriate in this situation?
I guess what I would say at this point is I would recommend that you all let us, pivots with the tax department and see what we can do and how complicated it might be. And, I think we can, based upon what we have here, not necessarily without numbers, but I think the general thrust of it is you all are looking to increase the income thresholds and the house site caps.
And the circuit breaker, maybe.
At the bottom.
But,
And we would like to use quintiles. And I appreciate your use of Yiddish always, and whenever that's possible. And what were you going to say?
and what would be the commensurate increase in the property rate that you need, some understanding of what you need to raise from the people that are still outside of income sensitivity to pay for it. Otherwise,
Yes.
Yeah, if you're going to see some of the numbers like from 3,000 to 30,000, that would truly be a sledgehammer.
And please feel free to think of a future possibility where homestead and non-homestead are not tied together in statute as closely as they are now.
yeah, well, that's just a policy.
Okay.
Okay, we will look into that and see what we can do. I guess I don't make any guarantees at this point, but I think it's something that similar analyses have been done in the past, but I just don't want to get out in front of my skis and tell the committee that we can do this without talking to the tax department first.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. So
I guess we're on with that conversation.
we lost Grant.
Great. Well, he's still listening. Just turn his
He's
camera on.
listening. He'll pop
We're just
back.
teasing. You can stay away, Graham. It's cool.
Okay, so we've got that proposal, which would, whatever level, would result in higher income people paying a greater percentage of their income because they're paying out of their income. Because we'd raise the number where there's a limit based on spending, but there's a limit to what people pay. And the difference would have to be made up, more of the difference, by higher income households.
By higher property value house.
Property, that's right.
No, there is a relationship.
Yeah,
And we could
because
just-
your income, if you're on a
Yeah,
fixed
yeah, you're
income
right.
and you live in Burlington, you're going to be covered.
So we could just describe the scenario as a scenario where lower income people pay a lower percentage of their income or their property towards it, and that we're making up the difference somewhere, and we haven't actually decided on that somewhere yet.
That's true,
Well,
because we don't even know if we can
We have
model this.
non-homestead.
Could even be the non-homestead.
So that's the.
Now that, I've already had a business who wants me to
Come on, we were.
explain what we're doing, and I said, we're not far enough along.
Senator Cummings didn't hear me.
That's
There
for the
is no
best.
proposal.
I might have just pretended.
Can I suggest that when we
Okay.
come back next time, we sort of review that scenario, but
Mm-hmm.
also within the frame of the goals that we are laid out.
Yes.
And then we will also look, I think we're going to be getting some presentations on the general fund and their projected rate of growth or need. And just so we get this in a fuller context. Any other proposals out there?
I would like to still try to figure out if there's a way to have kind of what I think 9/11, I don't remember, wasn't around at that point, but some kind of surcharge that is on the income tax form. Even if it's a small surcharge.
It goes into the ed fund,
That goes into
lowers
the ed
everything.
fund that's not connected to the yield.
On everyone or on,
Yeah, on everyone. And then, but
okay,
then be based on income. So not the low income would end up paying it. So then you do the adjustments, but you do it on the income tax form and not on the property. You don't have to file your homestead.
okay, so everybody would pay a fee. There would be a set amount.
Yeah, like everybody
Based on-
pays 1%.
Everybody pays 1%, regardless of school spending, or would it be?
Yeah, it would just be money that goes into the ed fund and that
And would you
like
eliminate
sales tax.
property tax?
You would still.
Buy down the
The
property.
property tax would be low.
Okay, so this is C?
It's kind of a connection. I think of it as a mixture, but I also want to have parts of D. So I like parts of D, but then doing parts of B.
Okay, so you want a surcharge on everyone that would go into the ed fund.
I just want to look at it. I'm not
Okay.
decided, but I think it's worth thinking about, at least for myself. I want to think about it more before I give up.
Okay, as long as it's on everyone, because the minute we say just on some taxpayers, I start to
No,
have common benefits concerns. Can we treat different groups of taxpayers differently? I don't know. But, okay. So
But
we can model
yours is
that.
not tied to home ownership or anything. It's just every income filer, right?
but
Basically want to diversify the ed fund by adding another revenue stream.
right. But then use that surcharge to make adjustments instead of making it adjustments on the property tax. So instead of having you'd still do your homestead, but you wouldn't do the homestead credit. You wouldn't need that information because you were getting all that information on the income tax form. So you would try to deal with the fact that their income is low compared to their property tax on the income tax form instead of dealing it with on the property tax. So if the concern is,
Percent though.
I think so.
Okay.
yeah, I don't know what it is and I need to think about it more. I'm just putting out there as like, I'm thinking about this.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
that I might bring it up. I don't want to surprise you at the next meeting. So
No, I think, well, we don't have that many next meetings, so we're trying to get this all out. So next week when we do agenda planning, we know,
Can you think about it more by Tuesday?
yeah, I can think about it by
Well,
morning.
it's
Just talk
the
to
same kind of thing I've been trying to get at, which is what happens if you put something on the income tax that's not trying to substitute the homestead. So you get rid of that tortured, well, you have to tell us what your residential situation is before we figure out if you owe this line or whatever, right?
And I might decide, or we might decide that you just can't get there from here, and that's fine. I just want to get there in my own brain if I can by Tuesday.
It doesn't have to be by Tuesday, it would just be convenient to by Tuesday.
I'm
Yes.
kind of playing around with an idea. I've shared it with the dream team over here. And we're just go to a local homestead property tax rate, but then have a credit that can be obtained at filing based on household income.
So entirely property tax?
So that everybody would pay a property tax. It'd be a pretty low property tax because there'd be no income sensitivity, no adjustment in the fall, which would be based on your district's decision. And then you would apply for, if you were eligible, a household income credit at filing that was based on the income earning year that coincides with the property tax year.
So in April, I'd say I got no more money because I paid $4,000 extra in my property tax than I should have.
No, in April, you'd say, this is my household income for the year. And then the black box would calculate how much credit you get.
Right. That's kind of what I'm thinking.
But there's a huge cash flow. That's why we have the.
That's why we have escrow.
Interesting.
And if you're not in escrow, you probably don't have a mortgage. And if you don't have a mortgage,
I have a mortgage and I'm not in escrow because I didn't, no, because I don't want the bank taking,
Yeah, really.
like, taking interest on something I could take
But I
it.
mean, I'm
I can, like-
reacting, but I mean, I want to be supportive of your brainstorm, but I want to understand. We had a pre-base system, which was sort of what you're saying, except for where you trued it up was different. And one of the complaints about that was a cash flow problem for people that we're trying to help. And so I'm not understanding how the ramifications of that from what you're saying.
I'd say if there's a cash flow problem, then the escrow is an easy way to solve that cash flow problem.
What, I guess I still don't understand though how it's any different from the existing system that we
That's what I'm saying.
have, other than just sort of reversing the.
Well, it's
direction.
different in the
'Cause
sense
even
that-
if I hear you saying that the
Yeah.
taxes would be lower because there'd be no sensitivity. But when the rebate is applied later, that's gonna have to come out of something, and wouldn't that come out of the ed fund? and
Yeah, it would.
Raise the
It would.
next.
It would.
Okay.
But it coincides, your property tax payment coincides with your value of your house, the decision you make in March. And your credit you receive would be based on the amount of household income you had on the same year that coincides with that property tax year. And it's far simpler than what we have right now.
Because it's all the same year that it's occurring in rather than the delayed.
Yeah.
And the
Exactly.
timing works.
What's that?
If the timing works, why didn't we do it before?
Oh, I don't know.
You just thought of it.
If
I just think
anyone-
it's experience. You pay a property tax bill, and then you get a credit based on your household income. Admittedly, probably 6 months later.
I think it's the cash, that's why I keep harping on this. The reason is because of the cash flow, because it's not trivial. When people were getting at the outset, they were getting $4,000, $6,000, $8,000 of credit. So for somebody earning 50 grand, fronting that money was a big problem.
Yeah, I think that's something to deal with. Escrow is one way to deal with that.
Why?
And who's in charge of the escrow and who?
Mortgage.
The bank.
I don't
Whoever your escrow.
I don't have a mortgage. I'm not dealing with a bank. So where do I have to write a check in escrow?
Well, if you don't have a mortgage, then your cash flow is really mitigated. You know what I mean? If somebody doesn't have a mortgage, then they're in a much better position than somebody who does have a mortgage that does have escrow. Might have escrow.
Now like the whole world knows my particular financial situation, but I'm a hypothetical person, not a real person. Let's talk it all.
Simplicity, I mean,
Yeah,
right? It's one of the six principles.
One of them.
one of
Yeah,
them,
it is,
yes,
it is,
yes.
it is.
There's got to be a reason we didn't do it.
Thanks, everyone.
Right.
It's that time.
Gonna work in, turn your phone on.
When my phone is not doing well, maybe going down to the repair guy.
I
I
think
might.
if you turn it on, it'll
You
work.
think if I turn it on, it'll do
So
it?
when are we meeting again, Portia?
We are meeting on the 26th in room 11, 10 to 4.
10-4.
Same time, same place.
Is that a Wednesday or Thursday?
It's a Wednesday.
2 weeks.